Welcome to eDiscovery Leaders Live, where I get a chance to chat with luminaries in eDiscovery and related areas. This broadcast is sponsored by Reveal-Brainspace, the industry's leading AI eDiscovery platform. Don't forget to subscribe to watch me, George Socha, weekly with leaders in eDiscovery. Thank you for tuning in. Welcome to eDiscovery Leaders Live, hosted by ACEDS and sponsored by Reveal. I am George Socha, Senior Vice President of Brand Awareness at Reveal. Each Friday morning, once a week is enough, once a day would be too much. Each Friday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern, I host an episode of eDiscovery Leaders Live where I get the chance to chat with luminaries in eDiscovery and related areas. Past episodes are available on the Reveal website. Go to revealdata.com, select resources, then select eDiscovery Leaders Live. Our guests this week are Michael Kriegal and Rajuan Pasha, both of Transperfect. Rajuan is a director in Transperfect's London office, or rather, he is a director in Transperfect's London, we'll see how I do today, London, Dubai, and EU eDiscovery project management teams. He's an eDiscovery specialist. He's got over 10 years experience in managing projects and providing consultancy services in the litigations, arbitration, investigations, information governance, GDPR, TAR, and data analytics. He's worked for some of the largest eDiscovery vendors, managing multi-jurisdictional and complex projects. He's got hands-on experience working on projects with bespoke and custom workflows while providing support and advice to major law firm and corporate clients, helping them manage their eDiscovery projects. Michael Kriegal is a Vice President, Consulting Services and Antitrust Practice Group at Transperfect Legal Solutions in New York, where he leads the technical consulting team. Rajuan is in London. This includes work related to TAR, analytics, Brainspace workflows, onboarding of new technologies, application development, as well as creating solutions for the ever-expanding needs within the eDiscovery realm. He's always on the lookout for new data source types. Really? With a focus on solving client needs for the review and production of non-standard data. I know plenty of people who would be happy with never again another new data source type. Before moving to the eDiscovery industry, Michael practiced law, gaining after that valuable experience as an ESI analyst, project manager, and team lead of project managers. Rajuan, Michael, welcome.
Thank you so much for having us.
I'm glad to have you join. Today, I would like to, I'm working off your two backgrounds and current experiences, focus heavily on analytics, data analytics, and TAR. And given that one of you is in London, the other in New York, look at those two areas from those two vantage points. If we can, let's start, Rajuan, with you and TAR adoption within the EMEA landscape. How has it changed in the past few years?
So in the UK especially, with the introduction of the disclosure pilot, where it's kind of prescribed that, on most data sets, the use of TAR should be there, especially with any data set that has more than 50,000 documents in it. And so with that provision, what we're now seeing is that it's actually become the norm rather than the exception. Very few review teams now like the idea of reviewing everything, and they'd rather go down that TAR route and be able to prioritize the review, cull the review through the use of advanced analytics. So that's the trend we've been seeing in the last few years, and obviously we're happy with that, and long may it continue.
I know it's hard to put a number on these things, probably impossible. But when you say it's now the norm in most teams, are we talking, say, 60% in that range, or 90% in that range, or somewhere in between?
Going by personal experience and the projects that we work on at Transperfect, I would say definitely it's around the 90% mark. Even with data sets that are below 50,000, much more manageable numbers like 35, 40,000 documents, clients are really receptive to the use of TAR. And it, as I said, the disclosure pilot has really driven that forward, because it's actually in there as a directive for disclosure projects.
So this in the disclosure project, disclosure
pilot, yeah.
right, the pilot, is this a requirement or a suggestion?
So in the last few years, it's been a requirement. So it was something that was devised by the English courts in order to make the cost and the time related to disclosure more proportionate, especially when claims are making it more proportionate to the claims, essentially. And so in the last, so it was introduced a couple of years ago as a temporary directive, and then it's been extended for another year, so it will carry on until the end of this year. But what it looks like is it's going to become a permanent fixture, and what this pilot does is it prescribes how disclosure is approached. So discussions between both parties in terms of what issues are in scope, who the custodians are, and then what kind of search terms they're going to use, and the use of analytics, and that both parties are agreed that analytics will be used and reported on effectively.
Mike, jumping to the US, how are we doing? Are we at 90%?
I mean, I don't think quite 90%, but I think we're doing great. I mean, there's been a huge uptick. So for me, like, I just started using Brainspace in 2017, kind of switching from relativity analytics. But I remember kind of back in the day, it was really hard to get people to apply, especially Cal workflows. TAR 1.0 always kind of was in the regulatory, like compliance type sense, and just kind of, expanded a little bit, but mostly stayed there when you really just need to comply. But Cal has exploded over the past, 5 years? I would say for large projects, let's say over 100,000, I think we're probably at 80 to 90%. I would say for smaller cases under 100,000, we're probably more around the 50 to 60% range. Really, just sometimes there's unique workflows where it may not make 100% sense. They're not doing a straight linear review, but it's really exploded over the past 5 years. I'll also say that I've been to London a few times and worked with the London team. Last time was actually in 2017. And I remember just being there. Cal was very, very new. It seemed like London was a slower adopter, but now with with this, things have really changed the landscape there.
For the US, I hear varying and very different anecdotal reports about the level of usage of TAR. And to a certain extent, people seem to tie it to their different default platforms, the one they use out of the gate. So I've heard some people say things akin to what you just said, but I've heard others say that they rarely see TAR in use. Now, without knowing who they are, without knowing what they're basing that on, without knowing what platforms we're talking about and any differences that might occur from that, what are your observations about those comments?
I think there's still a little bit of certain attorneys are still a little bit nervous to use it. I think especially when it's a very, a judge maybe that has kind of pushed away from certain technologies. There's a little bit push towards disuse. But I would also, on the flip side, say that I help run the consulting team here, and we focus on AI. So I might see more of it than, let's say, some of the other project managers here as well. So it's a little bit from both ends, but I think a lot of it really is having that conversation early on with the client, especially when you start to see the numbers of documents that like potentially need review, and you're scoping out that budget. It's a really good time to insert that conversation. And most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, you know, once the difference in potential budget comes to review, you know, they'll see that burden of review and you know, switch to using tar. And you know, you can always use the you know, the whole conversation of you can still review everything. You'll just review it in a prioritized manner. And then at a certain point, they're like, we spent enough money. Let's cut this off. Let's not you know, let's be proportional to the amount of data that we have and the cost of the budget.
How much does, and I'll ask this of both of you, but how much does the level of adoption change as you look at different types of matters or different jurisdictions? And Rajuan, why don't I start with you on that?
Sure. So in terms of the types of projects, so you know, I mentioned this disclosure pilot earlier. So that refers to mostly commercial or property claims in the courts. So tar usage is quite high there from what we see. But then in terms of investigations, for example, internal investigations, or kind of in anticipation of an antitrust regulatory case, you know, interrogating internal data and so on. What tends to happen is the clients aren't aware of the fact that they can use analytics, and then we come in and start explaining to them how, you know, the use of analytics can make their investigation more powerful. You know, they don't want to be sifting through terabytes of data for no reason. You know, helping them get into the meaty material really quickly. So adoption is getting there slowly with investigations, and I think it will continue as people see the value of using powerful analytics for investigations. And then you have in the UK, we tend to get DSAR cases, so document subject access requests. In those scenarios, and entity extraction, for example, is a really powerful tool because you're trying to identify all the personal information. You know, Brainspace is an entity extraction, for example, gives you all of that, you know, all the social security numbers, all the European kind of personal data that you could find in documents. We're able to quickly extract those, put them into an auto redaction workflow, and then speed that process along. So once we kind of explain those workflows to potential clients, you know, adoption tends to be really high because, you know, especially with DSARs, you have a really short period to get everything done. Using tools like this to speed things along always helps. But then once you go a bit further afield, say, you know, we work with a lot of clients in South Africa or Dubai and so on. Once you get further afield, there tends to be a bit more caution when it comes to analytics, purely because on a lot of the occasions, they just haven't come across advanced analytics. They're used to doing more linear reviews. And in terms of, you know, their disclosure obligations, they don't have as many strict regulations or guidelines as we do here in the UK and Europe and the US. And so kind of the cost side of it usually ends up being a factor that they consider a lot. You know, you have to kind of explain the cost benefit of it, and in terms of, you know, how much they're going to save in terms of cost and how much they're going to save in terms of review time. So it takes a bit more in order to get adoption, you know, further afield outside of the EU.
And Mike?
So I would say, so antitrust, merger control, it's basically always used. I would say the cases that I see it used the least often are a lot of times when we're doing things like remediations, where basically you have to be, you know, have almost 100% precision, where you really need to get every single document and let's say get it off of that device. Or if the concept behind or the idea of what makes something responsive is more of like definitional instead of conceptual, like, let's say anything related to like schematics or something like that. That's something like, a Brainspace or relativity analytics is probably not going to do a great job. It's probably better to look at the metadata or to use some sort of image identification analytics tool. So I really see it as kind of the differences of what you're doing with the data, the type of data, and what the definition of relevancy is as what's kind of making it or breaking it. I would also say oftentimes it's really just how sophisticated is the client, and sometimes it takes a little convincing, and sometimes it doesn't always work. A lot of times, if it's the first time they've used it, it makes them nervous, and we try to help and guide along the way, give excellent reporting, help them understand the concepts behind it. But sometimes it just takes that first job to understand and realize the benefits, and then once you get that, it's usually pretty easy to push it forward. I would also just say a lot of times it's just document counts too. Like if it's 30,000 documents, sometimes clients just like, let's just review it, whatever, it's easier. We don't really want to put the effort into doing this and then having to deal with the potential for questions from opposing counsel or the judge. Let's just do a straight linear review. I really see document count as being one of the biggest drivers, though that number of what the minimum is has been notching lower and lower, and we really don't think there is a minimum. It's more of sometimes just getting the client to understand the benefit even on small subsets of data.
Data analytics goes far beyond just TAR or technology-assisted review. Rajuan, you gave a few examples earlier. Care to expand on the different types of data analytics and what you see as most powerful and useful for clients?
Sure. I mean, so, if we look at structured analytics, I think, something as simple as email threading can be really powerful. It can cut down the data size, the review population by 10-20%. So, we as a standard try and tell our clients to use that in all of their reviews, regardless of the size. And not only that, it helps you make your review more efficient. But then in addition to that, near duplicate analysis is also very useful. Sometimes you get data sets coming from various different sources, and they may not dupe out in the traditional sense because the hash values are just not matching depending on where they come from. The use of near duplicate analysis helps with that a lot, and helps you identify further duplicative documents and cut down that review sets. But then in addition to that, in an investigative scenario, for example, communications analysis, that is a really powerful tool, looking at who's speaking with whom, what kind of topics they're talking about. Getting quick insight into that is always really helpful. And then I also think that clustering is an excellent tool. Clustering, I feel, is really powerful in identifying redundant document sets, system files or handwritten notes, where you're getting a lot of gibberish text. You can really quickly zoom into those documents and identify them and eliminate them. So yeah, those tools are definitely really powerful in a review.
And Michael?
So one thing I just mentioned earlier was kind of image and media analytics, which I'm seeing pop up more and more. So trying to shuffle through the different types of images and try to categorize them. I think because of the advent and like the explosion of data sources, especially cell phone data, Teams data, Slack data, we're sending a lot more images. We're collecting a lot more images, especially with phones. A lot of these devices are personal devices where you might have one or two mixed in that might be relevant, but then you have a bunch of family photos. So it's really something that I'm super excited for as we take on more and more of those projects, is to kind of sift through these large sets of data where a lot of this is really, unrelated to what's happening. And it takes a lot of people power to kind of just go and click, document to document, look at these images. I'd much rather have a computer do it for me. It seems like a little bit of a waste of time if we get a computer to do the image analytics for us. And then of course, once it's categorized, maybe we have, a human go and make sure whether it's truly relevant, but you can do those top level kind of shuffling and categorization, using machine. And I think it's great. And so some of those are kind of built out of the box, what's already available, but some, I know there's custom kind of image classifiers and things like that, where you can classify images based on giving it training samples of, this is what schematics for this, looks like. This is what maybe a chalkboard looks like if you're thinking of people snapping pictures in boardrooms and engineering rooms and things like that.
Whether you're seated in London or whether you're seated in New York, English is by far from the only language that you're going to have to deal with. I know I was a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa many years ago, and there, if you didn't speak 4 or 5 languages quite well, you were probably a little slow. We've got a lot of different, in St. Paul, where I live in Minnesota, 182 different languages just in the St. Paul public school system. How do you deal with all of that? You've got to be encountering it.
Yeah, I mean, all the time. Transperfect as, a language company as well. Obviously, we deal with this a lot, whether it be translations or just multilingual data sets. The answer is it can be hard. I think the biggest, not the biggest, there's a bunch of things to consider. So one thing to consider is language detection on a whole is not fantastic. It does the best job it can. It's not fantastic. Number 2, searching for a foreign language can be very, very difficult because it's very, very nuanced. So for example, a word such as close could have different meanings. So CLOSE. So it could mean like I'm close to you, like in a relationship sense. It could mean I closed the door. Those all might have different verbiage in foreign language that we may not be thinking of as well. There's the question of accents. Accents may change the meaning of a word as well as just phrases and a phrase in English might be very different. It might have a very different meaning in let's say Spanish. So it brings up a lot of complexities. I think one of the nice things about TAR, or one of the nice things about conceptual analytics, is it's really kind of, it doesn't have that knowledge. It's kind of you're training it as to what's interesting. I think it's also important that you kind of do your best to train the languages separately, because you don't want them really to be influencing each other. So one thing that we like to do is we'll train kind of like a separate model for, let's say, Spanish or Korean. We'll train a separate model for English, and then we kind of bring it all together in the end. So the idea is if there's, let's say, 10% of one language and 90% of one, if you're doing training and having the system select your documents for you, you're not going to get very much of that language that's 10%. So you really have to do its own training to get a representative sample. So there's just so many things to think about foreign language. It's really exciting, actually.
You make it sound daunting more than exciting.
It's both. Like everything in e-discovery, it's both.
Yep. Rajuan, what's your take on multilingual content?
So in terms of what Mike just described as a workflow, we actually encounter foreign language probably more than in Europe than we do in our US teams, and the workflow by and large is the same in terms of how we approach it. So as Mike said, the search terms, thinking about how to run those search terms on multiple languages, and then using conceptual analytics to split out the document sets into language groups, and then running algorithms on each one of them. But then in addition to that, we also think about translation. So there can be instances where you just don't have reviewers who speak a particular language, so you need to be able to translate those documents in a cost-effective way so that a reasonable decision can be made on their relevancy. So we use quick translation applications that we have on built into Relativity. We can use machine translation. We can use human translation as well. So depending on what the needs are, what the costs, what the budgets are. But by and large, the workflow would be similar to what we do in the US.
We have just a few minutes left. I'd like to at least touch on merger control proceedings and the impact of TAR there. So first, whichever one of you wants to take this on, when I say merger control proceedings, what does that mean?
I can jump in. For me, so mostly U.S. based, but I'm thinking second requests, HSRs, things like that. But of course, there's the European, Canadian, equivalents, everywhere, Mexico, wherever. But basically, when you're trying to comply in a very short period of time, 60 or 90 days, and you have millions of documents, you need to use TAR, you need to use analytics. There's no way you're going to just get through that data otherwise. Even with TAR and analytics, it's an extremely daunting task, to use your words. Unfortunately, that's been my life for the past couple of months. I've been dealing with a lot of sleepless nights. But having expertise there and kind of partnering with a team, a consultant, or a group of consultants that kind of know how to guide you in the right direction is really important there. So whether you're going to do a TAR 1.0 workflow, which is really what we see more often than anything, or continuous active learning, especially if it's like a low richness data set, and kind of understanding how to get the best bang for your buck on that training. Obviously, the subject matter experts are doing a lot of the training, especially in the TAR 1.0. And their time is everybody's time is extremely valuable, but their time is especially expensive. And we want to minimize the impact to them while getting the best quality training, to make sure that each document trained is getting the best exponential value throughout the rest of the data set. So it's really important to be smart about how you're selecting your data for training. It's also really important to help them understand, especially for people who are reviewing this type of workflow for the first time, how to review and to communicate with the other reviewers. Because oftentimes, if there is let's say an issue that is borderline and one reviewer is coding it one way and one reviewer is coding it another way, you're going to get a drop in precision in your review. Essentially, the predictive model isn't going to really know, is this a relevant document or not? So it's really, I think a big part of this is just communication on the review teams and a good understanding as to what is relevant or not. And if something is borderline, to kind of have a team approach there so everybody takes that same approach. It's really important to kind of speak with each other.
So Rajuan, I'd like to circle then back to the initial question, but this time in the context of, whether it's the UK's competition and market authority or the European Commission, or for that matter, the Department of Justice or Federal Trade Commission. What is the level of adoption with those types of organizations when it comes to TAR and data analytics?
So with the CMA in the UK and the European Commission, adoption it's actually not high at all, because it's so in the US, the DOJ is kind of they're aware of TAR and they accept the use of TAR more widely. In Europe, in the UK, there's a convincing that needs to happen, a negotiation that needs to happen, depending on, normally what it is run some search terms, whatever's responsive. Some groups would just run a privilege screen over that and then disclose everything. Others, if they can negotiate a bit of time, might do some review and target certain portions of the document. But in terms of convincing the FCA and the CMA and the EC on the use of TAR, I think what we need to do, what we essentially try to do and target them, is by telling them that, the first thing that TAR does, it enables the organization to organize their data so that they're able to give you the most the precise documents and what's actually relevant to what the issues are in terms of the merger or the acquisition, and then explaining that to the European Commission or the CMA, I think would be a good start in terms of getting adoption for them and enabling the organization to use technology assisted review in the actual review of the documents. Because what tends to happen is if you go down the route of just running search terms, you're giving them a lot of redundant data, which they're then using resources on their side to review, which is not the best use of their time. So just the argument is we're going to give you something that's more precise, something that's more targeted to what you're looking for. So the review on your side will also be efficient, and you'll get all of the information that you need.
Well, Rajuan, Mike, thank you very much for joining us today. Mike Kriegal is a vice president, consulting services and antitrust practice group at Transperfect. And Rajuan Pasha is a director e-discovery at Transperfect. Thank you both for joining us today, and thank you for the discussion about TAR and data analytics from both sides of the pond.
Thanks so
Thank you
much
for having us.